In the first week, you learned about the differences between the major studio system and the independent system. You learned about the specific as it relates to their finance models, and you got a basic overview over the industry and the landscape. This industry overview leads us through the major studio system versus the independent system and points out main differences between the two, especially in relation to development rights and cost. The history of Hollywood, from the golden age of Hollywood to the golden age of television today. An overview of the main historic events in the Hollywood industry. The first Hollywood studio was launched in 1911 by Al Christie and David Horsley during the silent film era from 1911 to 1929. After the silent film era ended, the golden age of Hollywood began, during which the Big Five, which included the major studios Paramount, 20th Century Fox, MGM, Warner Brothers, and RKO, controlled all films released in the US. In 1948, the Supreme Court changed the laws. Hollywood studios could no longer own their own theater chains. In the 1950s, a big change occurred again. The television industry grew, forcing studios into producing television content in addition to features. Today's Big Five are Paramount, Warner Brothers, Disney, which bought Fox, Universal, and Sony Columbia. And during the recent years, these major studios changed course relating to the content they're producing. Today, they're mainly focused on high-budget feature franchises based on established IPs, also called tentpole pictures. And of course, studios are launching their own television and streaming services.
We all can imagine that if a studio produces a film, it would probably be done for a different budget range than if the same film, which actually the same cast, the same director, the same writer, would be produced independently. We will in later chapters go into what the differences are, where the cost difference come into place, and how the economic model works. But for this very moment, I'd like you to look at the difference between making a studio project happen and making the same happen in an independent fashion. So let's say you are a content provider, which could be anyone, a writer, a director, an actor with a project, a producer with a project, anyone who has a script. And that person would pitch the script to the studio, and the studio says, fantastic, we'll love it, we'll make it. What happens in that case is that the studio would buy all rights. They would control the development and the development cost. They would pay for and control the production, and they would pay for and control the distribution. What that means for the content provider is they lose all rights. And you know what, if the studio pays nicely, it's not so bad, but you just need to know what you're getting yourself into. You lose all rights. What happens sometimes is, and it actually happens more than not, is the studio will buy the rights from you, maybe through an option, maybe through a purchase, and then they would not necessarily produce it. They'll just sit on it, and it may or may not get made. You don't know, and you have no control over that. When you do a deal with the studio, let's say they make the movie, they distribute the movie, what you could expect would be potentially a fee, depending on your role, if you're a writer, a producer, director, or whatever your position is when you provide the content. You could sometimes also be receiving a net profit participation. But in any event, if the studio buys the rights and produces and distributes your project, you will not own any rights. The best thing that could happen is that you get a fee and you get a net profit participation. Now, if you take the same project and decide, I'm going to do this on my own as an independent project, or if you have a project that the studio declined, you would then control the entire process. You would control the development, you obviously own and control the rights, and you would control the production and distribution aspect of it. What that means is you're not going to get a beautiful check from a studio and you have to kind of piece it all together on your own, and how you do that is what you learn in this course. But it also means that you decide the destiny of your project. You decide how much you want to spend for development. You decide who is going to be in the cast. You decide how and who is going to be distributing your project, and you have total control over the revenue. And more so, you will control the IP and all that comes out of the IP. Spin-offs, books, whatever ancillary rights are available, you will be in control of those. That's the main difference between producing a studio project and producing an independent project. Let's look at some of the differences as it relates to studio and independent financing. And again, we're going to go into this area much deeper in the course, and I just want to warn you that some of these aspects will feel a little repetitive, but it's not meant to annoy you. It's meant to really make sure that you understand the intricacies that are applicable with each and every finance element. So even though it might sound a little repetitive, there are additional components that I will be referring to, just to give you a heads up. Now, what are we looking at here? Major studio versus independent financing. What are the different components that are different? What are the different cost factors that one has to look at? So let's assume for a second we have the same project, the same script, written by the same writer, and we have the same cast and the same director applicable. And we have the choice of making it with a studio or making it independently. The first cost component that you need to look at is the rights and development cost. The studio will usually pay a little more for rights and development. And that has to do with the fact that the development period is usually longer with a studio than it would be with an independent production and an independent way of making the movie happen. Reason being, an independent producer is more focused on getting it happen and making it happen and works on it harder to make it work and close the project, versus a studio, you know, they can take their time. They have various projects that they're working on at the same time, and they may or may not, you know, actually produce what they develop, as I mentioned earlier. So the rights and development costs are higher also because their executives are higher paid people than the independent producer in that case. And the writer who, you know, you would as a producer option the script from would likely get more money working with the studio than working with you as an independent producer. So they may not have the luxury of working with the studio, and therefore you have a chance as an independent producer to get the script. But if we just look at the script purchase price, it would be more expensive if a studio pays for it than if an independent producer pays for it. And when we go to the overhead and producer fees, needless to say, studio executives are more expensive than an independent producer would be. An independent producer fee and overhead fee is usually managed through the budget having to be feasible, and sometimes it can be a good fee and sometimes it has to be a very small fee in order to get the project made. For a studio, they really look at their executives in their budgets also as a form of revenue. So they charge high overhead fees in comparison to an independent film, and they charge larger executive producer fees, obviously, again, because that's one of the areas where they make money. Now, production at studios and location, as an independent producer, it will be the focus to make the movie for an amount that is absolutely necessary to make it look good on screen. So the locations an independent producer would choose and the studio deals they would make would be much more feasible than a studio who produces this whole thing, let's say, on their studio lot or wherever they produce it, doesn't really matter. But any studio film that comes and, you know, goes to a location is usually have to pay more for a location fee because people also expect the studio to have higher budgets. So they pay more for location, and if you shoot it on their studio lot, the cost of shooting on a major studio lot are usually much more expensive than if you as an independent producer would actually rent that lot, that very same lot, or go to another studio lot, which can be anywhere. It could be in LA or could be anywhere. So in general, the production costs are much higher obviously from studios than you as the independent producer would have them. Now, when we look at the talent, if you go to Sandra Bullock and say, I'm going to make this movie independently, and if you imagine the studio going to Sandra Bullock and saying, we're going to make this movie with you, you can imagine that the agents will likely ask for more money from the studio than they would ask from you as a producer or content provider. They understand independent budgets are lower, and if an actor really likes the project, they will agree to lower fees. So the independent producers usually have much better ways of doing talent deals and those deals are much more flexible than what a studio would do. unless it's an unknown, in which case it's a whole different situation. But as a talent that drives a film forward in the theatrical world, they would be paid more by a studio than they would be by an independent. When we look at marketing and publicity, there's different ways to market a film project. The studio would go the campaign way, where they, release the films on, let's say, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 screens in the US, and they have a campaign that goes along with that to make sure that the film's awareness all over the nation is there. So they spend a lot of what is called print and advertising money, which is the campaign money to make people aware of the movie. The independent works a little different. They have a publicity budget that's in the budget, and it's usually smaller, and it really is geared toward the international sales of it, and that it's money that is handed to an international sales agent versus money that is handed to a distributor. And there is a difference between a distributor and an international sales agent, which we'll discuss during this chapter. So when you read through the material, you'll understand what it is. But for this exercise, it is important to understand that the marketing and publicity cost for the independent, they are very carefully allocated to make sure that the marketing and publicity is geared toward the buyer, which could be a buyer in a country, and it's not necessarily your audience that goes to the movie theaters and buys a ticket. We're going to go more into the differences during future chapters, but this is the main difference. The distribution, exhibition, and merchandising kind of goes in line with that. The merchandising rights with the independents are obviously all theirs, and they can develop the merchandising whichever way they want, and it really has to do with the genre and if it's really feasible. And the studio, when they do these big blockbuster franchise movies, they usually automatically have merchandising associated with it and building their little toys and whatnot in relation to the big blockbuster. For them, the merchandising is a big revenue component, which is really not so much for the independent. The legal and accounting costs are usually higher with the studio as well, because they do the accounting in-house. So they have a whole department that figures out how much money did we make with the movie, where do our profit centers lay. We have to pay ourselves first in all the various areas, meaning the overhead, the production, the distribution, the P&A. We pay ourselves first. These are all our profit centers, and then we see what's left. The independent world is very different in the sense that revenue is easily, allocated, because the money in the independent world comes from the international sales, meaning selling a film to a territory, a different country, and it's easy followed. But here for the studios, what they do, handling the accounting in-house, also means that all the expenses are deducted from box office and distribution revenues, and as a result, even a blockbuster like Harry Potter could still be in the red, having made, hundreds of millions of dollars in the box office, because of this, what the industry refers to creative accounting. The revenue is managed through a neutral third party in the independent world, which are collection agents, and we'll talk about who they are and what they do later. But this collection agent makes basically this creative accounting that is handled by the studios in a certain way impossible, because the streamline of the revenues is much more, scrutinized is probably the right word. Obviously, in the independent industry, there's always, there will be crooks, and you'll stumble over people that try silly things. But what these silly things are and how they can be avoided, something you will learn in this class. So, no Hollywood creative accounting if you do it right.
So when you pitch an idea to a network or a studio, and the studio decides to pick up your idea, meaning they would develop it, finance it, produce it, and distribute it, they would then control all rights. It's the same for major studios as it is for television networks. But if you decide as a producer to keep certain rights, maybe it's a situation where you're forced to do so, you might find yourself in an advantageous position. For example, Star Wars, George Lucas excluded rights to this IP and ended up selling it for $4 billion. So when he did the movie with the studio, he did not give them all rights. He kept merchandising and other rights, which In the beginning, it wasn't the idea, but he was forced to do it because the studio did not want to cover the entire budget the way he expected them to. A similar situation happened with Baywatch. The producer had Baywatch pick up the season 1, so the network owned Baywatch in season 1 and owned all rights, and then they decided after season 1 we're going to cancel it. The producer then asked if they could have the rights back because the network didn't want to continue, and the network agreed. The producer then funded the season through foreign pre-sales and licensed it back to the network station, but kept the foreign rights, and with that the revenues. Baywatch became a huge success, was produced for many seasons, and made hundreds of millions of dollars in rights revenues for the producers. Similarly, when Dog Whisperer was produced, the network station said, we're not going to finance the entire budget. We don't know this Mexican guy. We don't know if the series is going to work. We're only going to finance a certain portion. So the producers were forced to deficit finance the show somehow if they wanted to get it produced. The network then said, if you co-finance it with us, we will let you own the foreign rights. So the network agreed to take the US rights, and the producer kept the foreign rights. Over the 10 seasons that Dog Whisperer was produced, the foreign rights made over $90 million. So the producers made much more money by owning the foreign rights than just by making a producer fee, which would have been the case if they would have agreed to just sell the rights as a pickup deal to the studio or the network station. So when we look at a movie like Harry Potter, a tentpole movie based on a known IP, and we consider the fact that it made $612 million in box office, we have to wonder why it shows a loss of $167 million today. The gross revenues for these pictures are $609,912,643. So where did all the money go? Well, here's where it went. The studio charged a distribution fee of $211,800,286. It also charged for its P&A for the print and advertising campaign, $191,881,208. And of course it charged for the production costs it spent to make the movie, which was $315,892,107. And of course it's charging interest for financing this movie with $57,637,19. So that is why the proceeds / deficit today is $167,297,777. Each of these expense categories, the studio, distribution fee, the PA, the production cost, the interest, are all paid to the studio, and there are no caps on these amounts. That means the studio can charge whatever it wants for the services it provides. There's nothing wrong about it, but it's very hard to track expenses if there's no lid on them. That's why Harry Potter is a loss.